1936, the world was shocked by the news of General Franco's military uprising in Spanish Morocco. The smoldering fires spread immediately to the peninsula, and the land burst into sudden flames. In the big cities, the revolt was met by the spontaneous resistance of the unarmed Spanish masses and was dominated in the first days. The coup d'etat of the army generals had failed, but the pledged support of powerful interests encouraged the rebels to continue the fight.
The Spanish Civil War shook more than Spain. It shook the international community. Governments and civilians alike were rushing to form a response to the Civil War. The German and Italian governments supported Franco's coup as he attempted to install a fascist regime across the country, while the Soviet Union backed the Popular Front, a collective of communist and anti-fascist Spaniards. America, the UK, and France declared neutrality in the conflict. They sought to stop military aid going from their country to Spain, blocking anything other than medical supplies and blocking anyone other than medical volunteers. However, people still managed to smuggle weaponry and themselves into the country. About 3,000 Americans did just that and formed the Abraham Lincoln Battalion within the Popular Front. They were smuggled in with the help of the Communist Party USA, which received help from the Soviet Union. Most of the men identified as far left, with many having at least a passing interest in Marxism, though they had an important similarity. Each of them was an internationalist anti-fascist. The volunteers each had many reasons for wanting to prevent fascism's spread. Jewish volunteers saw Hitler's persecution of Jewish Germans. African Americans saw Mussolini's colonization of Ethiopia. Italians had seen their home taken over by fascism, and white laborers saw the crushing of labor unions under these governments. The spread of fascism worried them, because if fascism spread, then these threats would eventually come to their countries. The volunteers were already internationalists to a degree. They had to be in order to see this threat and then illegally enter France by crossing the Pyrenees into Spain. But the war would only increase these sentiments. The volunteers' time in Spain had allowed them to reflect on their political ideas. The volunteers would become more internationalists, give up more on liberalism, and develop a greater respect for the Soviet Union and communism in general. The volunteers saw that the international response to the war mattered. The Republican factions were often under-equipped, whereas the Nationalists had new guns, new planes, and plenty of ammunition. The volunteers, of course, knew exactly why this was. The Fascists had international support, whereas the Republicans didn't. Anytime they were on the battlefield, they saw the power of internationalism. This lack of response is exactly what made them lose faith in liberal nations and turn towards the Soviet Union, as the Neutrality Acts left the volunteers feeling abandoned. So, they turned towards those who supported them and their ideas. The Soviets, and the Communists more generally. If the Soviets and the Communists would support international fascism, then they'd support them back. The legacy of the volunteers is hard to track, as after the Spanish Civil War, many were investigated by various governmental institutions. This forced them to stay out of political activism, and forced them to stop expressing their views. Due to this, the legacy of them has been formed based on news articles and other depictions of the volunteers, often painting them as romanticized freedom fighters with a heavy focus on the anti-fascism parts. However, the leftist elements are often not mentioned. The reality of the volunteers is important to remember, even if their legacy doesn't match up with it. They were one of the first and most prominent American anti-fascist movements. It's important to see where they came from and how the war changed them. The connections of liberalism to fascism through liberalism's neutrality, the promotion of internationalism, and an affinity for far-left ideology are all important concepts in the history of American anti-fascism, and these ideas all came out of the volunteers.